Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our Working from Home and the Employer Considerations and Best Practices webinar. I'm Julie Lambeth, and I'm an Executive Vice President and Attorney Team Leader with PartnerSource. And I have with me today Janet Hendrick, who is a shareholder at Phillips Murrah and also a specialist in labor and employment. So we're going to talk about kind of the challenges in having working from home employees and also what an employer can do to set up the policies and procedures to help make sure that things run smoothly and people know what the parameters are of working from home. So is this our new reality? Maybe it's not quite so new. Employers have afforded employees the opportunity to work from home for years now. It's just that employers had to be extremely nimble due to COVID-19 because the number of employees who are working from home just exponentially increased. So they may have had policies and procedures in place, but prior to COVID-19, they had the ability to confirm that someone had a proper home office and had safety procedures and the proper equipment. Due to COVID-19, that wasn't possible. So when we look at working from home, what types of injuries are we seeing mostly? And that is really kind of honed in on cumulative trauma type claims and slips, trips, and falls. As again, employers had little time to develop and conform to their work from home policies and procedures. Employees kind of were thrust into their home environment, trying to set up their home office if they didn't already have one. Kitchen tables, dining room tables became the new office. So because of lack of proper workspace, things probably were not set up as ergonomically proper as they should have been. That contributes to those cumulative trauma claims. So we are seeing, carpal tunnel, that the desk may be too high or the kitchen table that they're sitting in isn't conducive to being able to properly utilize the keyboard. The other hazard that we see with working from home is the toys, the dogs, the stairs, things that we normally wouldn't have in the workplace. So people running downstairs or upstairs to get something from the printer or tripping over a dog to answer the phone or stepping on toys. Those are types of injuries that you have to determine, was the employee in the course and scope of their employment at the time that they injured themselves in that way? So how does the analysis differ from working in an office to working remotely? It really doesn't that much. It may be a little bit more fact intensive. You have the challenge of not having control over the premises, which isn't anything new to employers. For years, employers have had employees who go to client work sites, who go to client offices, who are traveling and going to a conference or traveling and staying in a hotel, and you don't have control over that premise. So it's kind of an unwitnessed type event, but now we don't have the ability to go in and investigate because it's at the employee's home. So the first step that employers need to do is take a look at the course and scope definition in their occupational injury benefit plan. And these definitions vary from plan to plan. So you need to understand in what instances are additional benefits afforded, kind of an extension of benefits for certain things, such as, was the employee clocked in at the time? Where were they? What were they doing at the time? Or did they actually deviate? And when you're talking about something from an employee traveling, that's a little easier to see, was there a deviation? If you have an employee working from home, then that's a little more difficult to determine if there is a deviation from that course and scope and if they were furthering the interests of the employer. So how does OSHA look at this? To me, it's great, and I love their examples that they have given, but OSHA looks at it that, there is an occupational injury if the employee is performing work for pay or compensation at home, and it is the performance of the work rather than the general home environment that causes the injury. So they're really separating out, furthering the business and, being at home. Where does that line lie? And it's interesting what I've seen with workers' comp cases is it differs a little bit under comp in some states as to what they consider that fine line, because some states will consider the home as just being an extension of the office. And so they kind of open it up to everything. Examples that OSHA provides are these below. This employee drops a box of files on their foot and injures their foot. They consider that work related, and that makes sense. Employee is a seamstress and pricks a finger and it becomes infected. That also would be work related. But this is the one that I see differ between workers' comp state statutes and OSHA. An employee trips on the family dog while they're running to grab the phone and it's work related. But is this a work related injury? Well, they tripped over the dog in the home. That lends itself to the general home environment or setting. So that would not be work related under OSHA. Or an employee is plugging in, their computer and they get an electric shock. That wouldn't be work related because it's the electrical of the home and not specific to the work being performed. They may have been plugging in their computer, but they could have been plugging in a light or something like that. So OSHA gives some really good examples of what they consider it to be work related. But what they have said, though, is work-related injuries, when it's determined that they are in the course and scope, they will remain reportable and recordable. So you still have to report those injuries just like you would on your OSHA 300 logs, do everything that you would. It's just that analysis of whether this is something that is covered under the plan. What OSHA guidance has further said is that they're not going to conduct inspections of employees' home offices. They're not going to hold employers liable for the employee's home office, and they don't expect the employer to go to the home office and inspect that employee's home office. So, it's interesting in that regard from a coverage standpoint from the benefit plan. We have the ability to cover these things that we feel are related to the furtherance of the business of the employer. What this kind of does take away is that liability exposure that we have as Texas non-subscription option employers, that we don't have control of the premises. So, OSHA's pretty definitive on what they would consider to be a work-related injury. But when you're looking at these from the plan perspective, the fiduciary responsibilities remain the same. So you have to be consistent in how you apply the plan provisions, just like if this is something that happened at work. You've got to do that course and scope analysis, identify the extensions. Did the incident occur while the employee was on an approved break? Because you have those gray areas and you have discretion in the plan, you can decide, is this something that we're going to cover? And if so, we're going to do it consistently for anybody who makes this type of claim. Were they clocked out at the time, but they actually were performing something that was work related? You have to look a little further to see what was going on at the time. And what's an interesting one that now comes up more since we're opened up a bit is that, so you have an employee who is working from home, but Texas has opened up and they need printer ink. So they get in the car and they drive over to Office Depot to get printer ink and are involved in a motor vehicle accident at that time. Is that something that's going to be covered? Is that considered course and scope? Are they furthering the business because it's something that they are using for work as well as home? Or is there also a deviation when they're going to Office Depot? And so it can get a little tricky. And, the thing about this is I don't think it's going away. From my discussions with a lot of employers, they're going to be working in a hybrid environment. So we're still going to have a lot of people working from home a few days a week and maybe going into the office a few days a week. So this is where these policies that Janet's going to be talking about are extremely important. You'll also need to look, though, at those exclusions. Do we have use of non-approved personal property? Was it something in the home environment that caused the injury? Is it something that we had control of? Did we provide the employee the desk or the keyboard or the computer, everything that they needed for that office? Did the employer provide that? And is that something then that we want to cover if it malfunctioned? So you need to be looking at those. Again, personal deviation, and this time not even from traveling outside of the office, but just going into the kitchen to get a cup of coffee, or as OSHA had said, tripping over your dog, or, doing something for the kids who may be, working remotely on schoolwork. Is there a deviation and that causes this not to be covered? Also, greater risk. If an employee was not doing anything, that their work would have put them at a greater risk. There are cases that the employee was storing things in their garage, and they were in the garage going through things for work, even though it was had a lawnmower plus work things. They considered that injury to be work related, even though tripping over a lawnmower would be more personal than work related. They were looking at work files in the garage. So you have to be very consistent in how you apply these. Know that you have that discretion to decide how you're going to do it. But I think you'll find that the analysis doesn't change a lot between being at work and being at home. But you have to dig a little bit deeper because you don't have some of those elements that help you in your investigation that you would previously. But what will really help in making determinations and really trying to minimize any injuries occurring at home would be to have formal remote working policies. And Janet is going to walk through what are the best practices and the things that you need to think about when you're looking at setting up the work policies. So I'll go ahead and turn that over to you, Janet.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I just want to thank everyone at PartnerSource for the opportunity to speak with you all this morning about work from home issues. Let me just share my screen so that you all can see. Let's see, I'm trying to get to. Bear with me for just a minute. Always the technical. Just trying to get to my, which I can't seem to get to. So I can show as a full screen. Well, okay, if I can't figure, I don't want to keep everybody waiting. So we'll just keep going. I want to start by saying, I remember probably in late April in 2020, everybody remembers that time, being on a walk with my husband and turning to him and saying, the world of work is never going to be the same. It's never going to look the same again. And he looked at me just like it was the most shocking thing that I could have said. And I don't think he really had realized it at that time. And I think it's absolutely true. I don't think the world of work will ever look exactly the same as it did before the pandemic. So what companies are now being tasked with is figuring out who's going to continue to work from home as things open up and it's safer to return to the office and the other work sites. And so here, history informs decisions. You have companies who historically have not allowed anyone to work remotely, like Google and Apple, coming out publicly in the last few weeks announcing they're going to allow a large portion of their workforce to work in a hybrid manner, sometimes with assigned days in the office. Sometimes the employees can choose the days they work. But what a lot of employers are realizing now is that although they thought pre-pandemic, a lot of positions could not be carried out at home or remotely, that they really can be. So pre-pandemic thoughts are now really being informed by what does work. Cost considerations. I mean, you've probably seen articles, I know I have probably daily, about large employers giving up real estate because they find that they just don't need as much space as they did before the pandemic, with a lot of employees choosing to work from home if they're allowed to. Employees are now being asked to share offices or hotel offices. I know with my firm, we've been working almost exclusively from home for over a year. And as we move into our new offices, which we're about to complete, some of our lawyers have elected to work from home certain days and will be sharing offices. So I think we're going to continue to see that same thing carrying across all industries, or most industries. The next bullet, working from home is a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I do a lot of work in this space advising my clients about reasonable accommodations. And this has always been an issue, or has for many, many years, where employees, qualified employees who have a disability, as that's defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act, have at times asked to work from home as a reasonable accommodation. And what we've seen historically is that many employers will decline that as an accommodation and say it's not reasonable and you can't really perform your essential job functions from home. Now what we see is the EEOC has come out publicly to say, employers, you need to look at the pandemic when employees were working from home as a sort of trial period. And you need to take that into account before you just out of hand reject an employee's request to work from home as a reasonable accommodation. And for anyone that wants more information on that, I would really encourage you to go to the EEOC's website, which is excellent in terms of organization and very user-friendly information. Their website is eeoc.gov. I look at it often. They've added COVID-related resources over the past year and a half, and they actually presented a webinar in September of 2020 answering a lot of frequently asked questions that the public submitted. So you can see those. It's very easy to navigate and look at some of these issues I'm talking about. The last bullet here, attracting talent, retaining talent, employee engagement. These are all going to be very important factors because what we see is employees like working from home if they're allowed to do that, and maybe choosing employment based on their ability to work from home at least part of the time. So again, employers who have sort of dug their heels in to say, we don't want people to work from home, or we don't want many people to work from home, may find that they are losing good candidates or have decrease in employee engagement and retention. So key remote work considerations, and this ties into what Julie mentioned, which is the importance of your policies. These are just sort of the key issues that I've been talking with my clients about over the past year plus. Pay practices. You need to be sure that you have, ideally in written form, a clear policy relating to how employees who are working remotely should be reporting their time and making sure that employees are not working off the clock as best you can. The Fair Labor Standards Act basically requires employees to pay non-exempt employees for all time that they have worked. And, the definition of that is very broad. So if you find out or should know that employees are working off the clock, answering emails, taking care of some administrative duties, you are required to pay them for that time. So you need to be sure that your pay practice policies are very clear, including your limits on overtime and reporting time. And I think, we've all found, for those of us that have been working from home, your work day looks very different when you're working at home. There seems to be sort of blurred lines at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. So you need to be sure that your non-exempt employees are aware of what their work hours are and how to report their time. Safety liability issues, this kind of ties into what Julie talked about. A lot of my clients are putting right into their written policies what they expect in terms of having a workspace that is set apart and, safe in terms of, what's around so that you can have some limits, hopefully, or minimize safety issues and liability. Performance management. Now we have people who are working in isolation. They're not necessarily under the eye of a supervisor or manager. So again, including in your written policies, the performance management doesn't change just because people are working at home. So holding people to the same standards, that means you're going to have mechanisms in place where you can check in with employees and the supervisors know what they're doing, whether it's periodic check-ins, coffee chats, meetings. And supervision, that really ties back into the performance management. How are managers going to supervise their subordinates under these new circumstances? Security is a very important one, especially when it comes to data and cybersecurity issues. One thing that most of my clients have worked into their written policies when they revise them is that this workspace should be set off from other areas in the home as much as possible, and that there should be limits on who has access to the information in the workspace, whether it's electronic information or documents the employee may be using, so that if someone is a visitor in the home, they don't go in and just have open access to client and customer or even the company's confidential information. So documentation and policies are critically important. Some employers had work from home policies before the pandemic. Some have revised them and made them more robust since the pandemic. And I'll touch on this on my last screen of takeaways, that it's important that you revisit your policies. So in terms of expectations, I mean, these are just some specific items that you can include in your written policies. What are the work hours, especially for your non-exempt employees? When are they expected to be available? I think what we've also seen, especially probably more for exempt employees than non-exempt, is that, again, the workday looks very different. I know it does for me sometimes too. I might start working very, very early in the morning and then take a break to do something else, in the middle of the day. And just working with your folks to make sure they understand when you need them to be available and to meet deadlines for deliverables. Reporting really ties back into that. Whether you want people to give you periodic updates on the projects that they're working on, just set out your expectations very clearly, either in writing in your written policy, it could be in a memo within a department, or at least verbally in team meetings. What is the clocking in and out procedure for non-exempt employees? I know a lot of employers, especially larger employers, use an electronic database for that, so they can do it right on their computer. But give thought to making sure that whatever the mechanism you have is accurate and it's being used properly. And think about the consequences if employees are not using it properly, whether it's discipline or making adjustments and course correcting the procedures you have in place. Video conferencing, just like this. We've all had to become very proficient in Zoom and Teams and other video platforms. And I know people are relying on it more than ever. To me, it seems like what we used to do in terms of a conference call is now usually in a video call. And what are your expectations for your team as far as having their cameras on, having their microphones muted or not muted? I know that some employers I've worked with have concerns because maybe they'll have a certain team member who always has their video or their camera off, and they realize they've really never communicated that the expectation is that you'll have your camera on, that's one of the benefits of the video conferencing, is to be able to see people and relate in that way. So make your expectations clear. Equipment use, reimbursement, wage deductions, that could be a whole separate hour-long webinar. But please be aware, if you're not already, that different states have different laws about reimbursement of work-related expenses. It could be internet, cell phone, that varies by state. So work with your employment counsel on that. And the same with wage deductions. If you're taking out deductions for anything relating to working from home, you need to be aware of the laws in your state relating to wage deductions. In Texas, although generally an incredibly employer-friendly state when it comes to requirements compared to somewhere like California, for example, or Massachusetts or New York, does have very specific wage deduction laws. And you can find those on the Texas Workforce Commission's website, but you have to have a written wage deduction authorization that is specific to what you're deducting for. Data privacy security, I've talked about. Again, larger companies certainly have mechanisms in place where they can take reasonable precautions to ensure the safety of their data. But give that thought, including whether you need to take some additional steps with employees working remotely. Injury reporting, Julie has already touched on a lot of these issues, but just making sure you have a very specific injury reporting policy in your written policies on what employees are expected to do, whether that injury is occurring in their home workspace or in an office or work site. So best practices. I can't emphasize enough that you have robust, documented, and well-communicated policies, that you revisit the policies, even though I know sometimes that's the last thing that employers who may be strapped for resources given the pandemic want to allocate resources to, but your written policies really can be your best friend when challenged or you get into some kind of issue with an employee. Make sure that they're communicated well and that you have proof that employees have received your written policies and ideally have acknowledged them either electronically or with a physical signature. Make your expectations very clear. Sometimes employers think that they have communicated clear expectations, and then they realize when they get into a certain situation that it probably could have been better communicated. Also, make clear the consequences. So if employees fail to meet up to your expectations, performance standards, injury reporting, whatever it is, what the consequences will be. Put that right into your written policies. This next one, single points of communication, depending on the size of your company, how many departments you have, make sure that you have allocated someone or assigned to someone to be a point of contact. The main reason for this is so you don't have inconsistent messages going out to your work from home workforce. So make sure that people know who they can contact if they have questions about work from home issues, and make sure that those people that are answering the questions are provided with consistent resources from the company to be able to give consistent responses. Open door policy continues to be very important as employees are working in isolated circumstances. And so sometimes behaviors that could create risk for your company may be going on where you wouldn't necessarily know it if you were all working in the office on video conferencing or otherwise. So make sure that employees remain aware of where they can raise concerns. Periodic check-ins can be great for your remote workforce, maybe more often than you ordinarily would do. That could be through a video conferencing meeting. They don't have to be long. It could be a 10-minute check-in, quick coffee in the morning. I know different companies are doing that different ways, and people are incredibly creative. So you can probably look for some articles and things if you're interested in how certain companies are approaching that. And this really dovetails into the periodic check-ins, creating opportunities for employees to engage with each other and their managers and collaborate and communicate. That remains important even though we're working from home. Flexibility, critically key. There is no one size fits all for any company, department, or even industry. So remain flexible. Take each situation on a case-by-case basis as best you can, and then you can start to form consistent messaging for repeat situations. So my top takeaways, take the time now, if you haven't already, to assess your current policies and practices and either create, my guess is that most companies, unless you're quite small, already have some kind of written policies addressing remote working, but it's a good idea to update those from time to time, as I think we all agree, things seem to change daily and no one necessarily has all the answers. We're all sort of having to pivot and be flexible as things come up. Make sure that you have effective lines of communication, whether it's electronic or otherwise. Be sure that you are keeping in mind your obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act and their state equivalents to accommodate employees who have a disability. That doesn't mean that you have to automatically grant work from home, even if you have been allowing that. And again, the EEOC has addressed that in a couple of very specific, great questions that most employers have. If we've been allowing work from home and this employee had requested it for a disability pre-pandemic, do we now have to continue? The quick answer is not necessarily. You have to look at those on a case-by-case basis. And you do have to take into consideration this sort of trial period that we've had over the past year if the employee has been working from home. Embrace flexibility. It's more important than ever to be flexible. And be sure to consult with your employment counsel with some of these trickier issues. There's no reason to go it alone. And although I don't think it's on here, it should be, because it's something I say in probably every presentation I give on any employment law subject, which is consistency is really key. So written policies and consistency, if you remember nothing else. And that's where that single point of contact can be important. You don't want to be giving employees in similar situations inconsistent responses. And I think that takes us to the end.
Great. Hey, thank you so much, Janet. I hope this was helpful. We do have the chat room available. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and put your question in the chat, and we can try to answer a few before we let everybody go. Amber, did we have any questions in there yet?
We do not have any submitted right now.
Okay. We can give it a few minutes, but I think you can see from talking about how we handle someone who is claiming a work-related injury, and if that injury is covered under the plan, really ties in to what Janet was talking about, and having great policies so that it gives you that structure and framework, say from things such as, hey, what are the work hours when we're talking about were you clocked in or clocked out? So that really kind of gives you the parameters to begin with, and then taking a look on a case-by-case basis and your plan language as to whether or not a claim would be considered work-related in furtherance of the business, or if it is something that resulted from just the normal home setting. So, and if we don't have any questions, then I guess we can let everybody go, and I hope you have a great rest of the week and a fantastic weekend.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks, Amber.